I'm Nicole von Germerton. I'm the director of the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, and I'm very, very honored to introduce Dr. Susan Stryker and welcome her to Oregon State University. Professor Stryker is a leading figure and founding scholar and theorist in the field of transgender history. As this field barely existed when she received her PhD in U.S. history from the University of California at Berkeley, Professor Stryker spent many years as a public historian in San Francisco, continuing to publish and develop this new field of study. Finally, when the academic world caught up with her, universities such as Simon Fraser, Indiana University in Bloomington, and Harvard University recruited her onto their faculties. And she's currently an associate professor in gender and women's studies at the University of Arizona. Along the way, she has published Transgender History, The Roots of Today's Revolution. She's won an Emmy Award for the documentary film Screaming Queens, The Riot at Compton's Cafeteria, and a Lambda Literary Award for the co-edited anthology, The Transgender Studies Reader. She's also the founding co-editor of the academic journal TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly. So today she's going to present a fascinating topic in her new book, What Transpires Now, Transgender History and Futures. And this is an event that's sponsored by the Horning Endowment, which the goal is to bring humanities perspective to the sciences. So we feel this is a pretty good topic for that. And also I just wanted to make a really brief announcement that we have another event that's somewhat connected to this event that's part of our Carson lecture series. It's a traditional lecture series in the history faculty, and that is the historian Lori Marhofer, who's coming on April 23rd, and we'll obviously advertise that, but just to let you know, and Lori's going to be speaking on gender nonconforming individuals in the Nazi regime. And then, of course, after that, in late April, we have the start of Holocaust Memorial Week, which is in its 33rd year, and one of the speakers that week will actually be an Auschwitz survivor, so be sure to come out for that, and you'll see those things, those events publicized as we get a little bit closer. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Susan Stryker.
Hello, great to see you all. Nicole, thank you for that introduction, and Natalia, are you maybe in the back over here? Thank you for helping make the trip possible. I'm often someone who sits on the other side of the desk, so to speak, and organizes campus visits for other people. I just know how much work it is to bring someone, so thanks for having me here. I do want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional land of the Kalapuya people. I just think particularly at a land-grant university, which is, I work at one, and this is one that we should really acknowledge that we are part of a settler society that, transforms the land into something that is of value to the settler population, often in ways that doesn't benefit the indigenous population. So I just always want to mark that. All right, here we go. Manifesting the realness of our identities is what we trans people do, and we can bring worlds along with us. This is our talent, our burden, our necessity, our gift. This is what transpires now. New realities, emergent trans realities, flowing across the gap that separates actuality from desire, flowing from what is to what will be. History is not the past. History is a story we tell in the present, one that reaches back to conjoin what can be known of what has already transpired to our vision of whatever yet may come. History is not a fact, but a promise. It is the assurance that the future will be as different from the current moment as the current moment has become from all that has come before. History is a witness that bears testimony to the inescapability of difference and the inevitability of change. To write history can be more than piling one dead fact on top of another to fill up the empty void of time. It can be more than constructing a monument to the violence of the great and powerful, more than the satisfaction of a craving among the people for the sweet comfort of nostalgia at the end of a bitter day. To write history for those of us who need another world, is to catch sight elsewhere of a radical possibility made visible by the light of a current crisis. History transpires in the here and now. It is the story that confers realness on pasts that are unremembered and actions now unimagined, in anticipation of futures that must be summoned forth from a present that demands our daily effort to shatter and transform it. Something has already shifted, something tectonic, climatic. We see the evidence all around us as surely as the continents grindingly adjust their placement, as surely as new patterns of air, earth, fire, and water arrange themselves across the planet's warming surface. There is no going back. Gender, a vast, impersonal social apparatus that, like some magical sorting hat at Hogwarts, whispers the secret of our identity into our ears and places us with our kind. Gender itself has changed and is changing still, is changing us, all of us. The novel configurations of personhood now bubbling to the top of the cultural stew, new gender minorities now clamoring for social recognition, are the signs and symptoms of a deeper flux in the field of life. The story of that Leviathan, gender, within and against whose shifting shapes we all move in our own peculiar ways, is the story that now must be told anew. Those are the opening paragraphs of my work in progress, a nonfiction book aimed at a general audience called What Transpires Now? Transgender Histories and Futures in the Present Tense. The book originated in 2015 amidst the froth of publicity that attended Caitlyn Jenner's debut on the stage of public womanhood, when the time felt ripe for a big book of transgender history, the go-to resource for all of those people who were in effect saying, what's up with this transgender thing? How come so much of that these days? Where did it come from? What does it all mean? And I said, well, I can tell you that story. 2015 now seems like a very long time ago. And the book that I envisioned then bears only a passing resemblance to the book that's now nearing completion. Back then, transgender people were experiencing heightened levels of visibility in media and acceptance in society and seemed on the cusp of gaining unprecedented forms of legal recognition, civil rights protection, and healthcare access. The transgender actress Laverne Cox had recently graced the cover of Time magazine for a story that asked, is America at a transgender tipping point? The Obama administration was boldly drafting executive orders offering new interpretations of existing anti-discrimination legislation, opening up the military to transgender service members, enforcing the provision in the Affordable Care Act that required coverage for medical services related to gender transition, and suing recalcitrant state governments to better secure legal equality for trans people. A landmark case on behalf of Virginia high school student Gavin Grimm's right to use a public school toilet that matched his gender identity and expression was on its way to the Supreme Court, which promised a definitive ruling on the constitutionally protected status of trans rights. It felt at the time that the biggest narrative challenge I faced in trying to write the book was cautioning my prospective readers against a premature celebration of transgenders' arrival at the table of citizenship and social inclusion, because the remarkable advances of the early 21st century were by no means evenly distributed. While it was increasingly possible for the most privileged trans people to count as normal in the eyes of the state, transness nevertheless functioned as an intensifier of every form of structural injustice, and levels of violence against trans people of color, particularly trans women of color, were sharply on the rise. When I started writing in the summer of 2016, Hillary Clinton was seemingly poised for the presidency with no indication that her administration would alter the course on transgender issues set by her predecessor in the White House. But 2016, of course, turned out differently than almost everyone expected. The election of Donald Trump radically altered the life worlds of transgender people, and many others, of course, transforming us in an instant from the latest poster children for neoliberal multicultural diversity into a frontline battlefield of the culture wars. The election changed the story that most needed to be told of the past. The words with which I begin the book, the words that I read earlier at the podium tonight, deliberately evoke and echo sentiments expressed by the philosophers Friedrich Nietzsche and Walter Benjamin in their writings on the uses and abuses of history for the present and on the perpetually available capacity nestled within each current moment for our deep narratives of change over time to become undone and rewoven. It is possible, Benjamin famously said, to take control of a memory as it flashes in a moment of danger. Writing in 1940, during the Nazi reign over Europe, his view of history resonates deeply today. Quote, "The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the emergency situation in which we live is the rule. We must arrive at a concept of history which corresponds to this. Then it will become clear that the task before us is the introduction of a true state of emergency, and our position in the struggle against fascism will thereby improve." The recent rise to power of a virulent new form of reactionary politics in the United States and elsewhere in the world, a fascism for our times, is the clearest illustration imaginable that a present calamity can change the questions that transgender people and others who are oppressed need to ask of the past as we seek to use a critical historiography to begin imagining a future that we want to live in and to forge a path towards it. I want to tell in shortened form just one of the stories that I tell in the book, that of Frances Thompson, who lived and died in Memphis in the middle of the 19th century. The rudiments of Thompson's story were first recovered for contemporary audiences by the historian Hannah Rosen in her 2009 book on post-Civil War Black womanhood, Terror in the Heart of Freedom. This vignette supplements Rosen's earlier work with original research of my own and exemplifies the kinds of violence that can be perpetrated at the intersections of transness, disability, and race to prop up the binaries that enable many kinds of social hierarchies. Three bloody days in Memphis, Tennessee, in early May 1866, helped ensure that the Civil War wouldn't really end, but rather shift into a different phase of antagonism known by the euphemism Reconstruction. A decade later, as Reconstruction was itself coming to an end, the war continued yet again by other means, and Frances Thompson's body became one of its battlefields. On those May days in 1866, the white citizens of Memphis, resentful after several years of occupation by Union forces, including regiments of black soldiers, rioted against the city's black residents. At least 46 black people were murdered, 75 injured, 100 robbed. More than 90 black homes, 12 black churches, and 4 black schools were burned to the ground. And 5 black women reported being gang raped. One of those women was Frances Thompson. Thompson was born into slavery around 1840, and the newspaper stories that provide most of the information about her life contradict themselves about whether she was originally from Virginia or Maryland or perhaps Mississippi, as well as how long she had lived in Memphis. Whatever the case may have been, by 1866, Thompson was living by her wits near the bayou in the Black District south of downtown in a bare little house on Gayoso Avenue. She was a familiar figure around town, nicknamed Aunt Crutchy because of the prostheses she used, she said, on account of the cancer that had disabled her legs. Thompson made a living as best she could. She took in washing and ironing, sewed clothing, and took on boarders for whom she cooked and cleaned. She told fortune and peddled hoodoo bags to her African-American neighbors. According to later newspaper reports, as well as surviving arrest records, she served as a procuress who helped arrange sexual liaisons, some of which were interracial. Thompson, in other words, was one of innumerable former slaves now adrift in the world, surviving by any means they could. On May 14th, less than 2 weeks after the Memphis massacre, Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, the ardent emancipationist leader of the radical Republicans who wanted to punish the South for its insurrection, saw in the Memphis massacre a chance to push his agenda, particularly the adoption of the 14th Amendment, which ensured that equal citizenship of men, regardless of previous condition of servitude, would be passed. Stevens proposed convening a congressional select committee to investigate the rioting with the goal of using it as political propaganda. His proposal was adopted, and on May 22nd, the committee, led by Congressman Elihu B. Washburn of Illinois, principal political patron of Ulysses S. Grant and a future presidential contender himself, arrived in Memphis to investigate what had transpired just a few short weeks before. On June 1, Frances Thompson hobbled into the meeting hall of the Gayoso Hotel to testify before Washburn's committee. She told how 7 men, including 2 police officers, broke into her house soon after midnight in the early morning of May 2nd, demanding that she and a 16-year-old boarder, Lucy Smith, who was also disabled and known by the nickname Stumpy, prepared a supper for them, which they did, in a bid to avoid provoking the intruders. After the men had eaten, they said they wanted some women to sleep with, to which Thompson replied that she and Smith were not that sort of women and they must go. The men replied that it didn't make a damn bit of difference to them what kind of women the two considered themselves to be. They stayed for 4 hours, with all 7 of them participating in the rape of one or both of the women. They ransacked Thompson's house, found and stole money that she had secreted away, looted the house of furnishings and food, and dumped what they could not carry away with them into the nearby bayou. The testimony offered by Thompson, along with the rape testimony of Lucy Smith, Rebecca Bloom, Harriet Armour, and Lucy Tibbs, was utterly unprecedented, not merely for its characterization of mass rape as a practice of systemic terror. Black women who so recently had been slaves without rights were still at that time not allowed to testify in municipal and state courts on account of their gender, and the congressional investigation offered them a novel opportunity to assert a newly claimed citizenship whose boundaries were still largely undefined for Black and female subjects. It was the first time in the United States that Black women had offered public testimony of any kind in a legal setting, asserting not only their honor and worth and outrage, but their status as citizens, entitled to stand before the bar of justice. All of the women told tales similar to Thompson's, of white men who approached them as if they were by definition available to them, who tried to insinuate that the women were prostitutes or that they wanted the men and didn't resist the sexual advances, and that there were political dimensions to the violence they suffered, of men who asserted not only masculinist power over women, but white supremacy and Black subordination, and a violent determination to restore all of the pre-war social hierarchies. All of the women, Thompson included, publicly refuted the characterizations others tried to impose on them and publicly defined themselves in their own terms. Thompson was one of 164 witnesses who gave testimony that ran to 1,200 pages in the congressional record, 11,000 copies of which were printed and mailed at government expense throughout the United States. The report was widely excerpted in newspapers from coast to coast. Thompson's story, along with the stories offered by the 4 other raped women, was given special mention. Quote, "The crowning acts of atrocity and diabolism committed during these terrible nights were the ravishing of 5 different colored women by these fiends in human shape," Washburn wrote in his prefatory comments to the published testimony. The accounts given by Thompson and Lucy Smith and the 3 other women became Exhibit A in the case for radical reconstruction, which soon became federal policy over President Andrew Johnson's opposition, in no small part because of the publicity given to the Memphis massacre and the testimony of those 5 women. A story published a decade later in the national weekly illustrated newspaper The Day's Doings noted that the committee's report startled the country and became a powerful campaign document used with great effect throughout the North and Northwest and among the Southern Negroes. Nothing in the report, The Day's Doings claimed, quote, "so horrified the country and intensified Northern prejudices against the South as the testimony of Frances Thompson." Thompson disappeared soon thereafter from the public record, but her story was resurrected several years later with tragic consequences in the context of a heated presidential campaign. Election season in 1876 officially kicked off in Memphis on July 11th of that year. The frontrunners were Samuel Tilden of New York, from the pro-business wing of the Democratic Party, who advocated ending Reconstruction, and Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, a moderate Republican who channeled a growing disenchantment within the party over the corruption and ineffectiveness of the administration of Ulysses S. Grant. Most voters that year considered the election to be a referendum on the future direction of the nation, whether the post-war period of Reconstruction would finally be brought to a close or whether it would continue. And on the morning of that very day, July 11th, as an opening salvo of the election season in Memphis, Tennessee, Frances Thompson was placed under arrest, subjected to a medical examination, charged and convicted of being a man impersonating a woman, fined $50, forced into men's attire, and sentenced to 100 days working on the chain gang of prisoners who maintained the city streets. This was a gendered form of punishment, usually meted out to men, but not to women, although sometimes used against women, as it was used against Thompson, as a way of stripping claims to normative womanhood from them. Appearing in public, quote, in a dress not belonging to his or her sex, as the anti-cross-dressing statute worded the offense, was first criminalized in Memphis in 1863 as part of a wave of similar legislation across the United States and the Confederacy during the war years. The spate of anti-cross-dressing ordinances might well have been related to efforts by men to evade the draft, or more likely to efforts by women and transmasculine people to try to join the army. But it's also the case that the cities known to have passed anti-cross-dressing laws between the 1840s and the 1860s were all experiencing a great influx of new people with scant ties or with no ties at all to the places they now found themselves living. Mid-19th century anti-cross-dressing laws were passed in places like Toledo, Ohio, situated at the nexus of the railroad and canal networks that linked Chicago and the continental interior with New York and the transatlantic trade. Houston, Texas, a commercial railroad hub for the export of southern cotton, and San Francisco, California, an instant city after the gold rush of 1849, which mushroomed from a sleepy Mexican village of 200 in 1846 to the largest city on the Pacific coast of the American continent by 1860 with more than 50,000 inhabitants. In Memphis, the new laws against cross-dressing coincided with a flood of black refugees from the Deep South who began arriving there in 1862 as the southernmost territory controlled by the Union. But whatever it was that provoked its passage, the Memphis Ordinance against cross-dressing was on hand and available for use against Frances Thompson when the moment came to take advantage of her anomalous status for an ulterior political end. Frances Thompson had had run-ins with the law for many years previous to her arrest on the morning of July 11, 1876. According to one newspaper story, she had been, quote, arrested several times on suspicions of being a man and for notorious lewdness. Perhaps, as Thompson said in a jailhouse interview, because she could, quote, disclose startling secrets which would bring disgrace upon and ruin many a white man in Memphis. Thompson also claimed to have told the authorities numerous times that she was of, quote, double sex, with physically ambiguous genitalia, but that she had been raised as a girl and always dressed in feminine fashion and considered herself to be a woman. In 1876, however, her gender anomalies, apparently long known, proved too useful not to exploit. In that first expose of Thompson's gender history, the Memphis Public Ledger made sure to remind its readers that, quote, it will be remembered that when the Congressional Committee investigated the Memphis riots, Frances Thompson swore that she had been outraged 13 times, and this was used by the Radical Party as part of the campaign thunder to excite the Negroes and keep them in the ranks of radicalism. That reminder was to be repeated incessantly in the months ahead, as Thompson's story was picked up in newspapers from Michigan to Louisiana to Washington, D.C., and profiled in the nationally circulated Illustrated Weekly, The Day's Doings. Quote, Since the Rads made such immense political capital out of Thompson on account of his adventures during the Memphis riots, the Memphis Daily Appeal satirically opined on July 13th, they should, as a matter of justice, change the name of their party to the Crutchy Club. The subtext of all such stories was that because Thompson had purportedly misrepresented her true sex, her testimony before Washburn's committee was therefore suspect, and that an important rationale in the argument for Reconstruction was thus based on a palpable falsehood. Most pointedly, the assertion that Thompson's genitalia were different from that of most other women was used to imply that she could not possibly have been raped. And the sad fact of the matter is that rape was legally defined as non-consensual vaginal penetration. Whatever outrage was perpetrated upon the person of Frances Thompson, if she did not in fact have a penetrable vagina in the eyes of the law, she could not have been raped. The extrajudicial violence she experienced remained without a legal name. Nearly 50 newspaper articles were published about Thompson during the presidential election cycle of 1876. Many of them by Democratic-leaning presses that mocked the Republicans for having been hoodwinked by a gender charlatan. And these stories used the stigma associated with blackness, transness, sex work, and disability to pillory their political opponents. They labeled Thompson an infamous his/her and punned on race and gender by accusing her of being under false colors as a man who has successfully passed as a woman. In imagining, quote, how the dusky Thompson's lower limbs were as crooked as a young dogwood tree or a ram's horn, they associated her difference from gender norms with the status of being non-human. The press further assassinated Thompson's public persona by questioning whether she was actually disabled. His lameness does not amount to much, the day's doings noted, claiming that, quote, the use of crutches was but an affectation to facilitate his infamous calling, and was in fact a long-standing ruse, dating to pre-war days, to appear so lame and crippled that as a slave she would have been of little value. Public attention to disability was on the rise in the middle decades of the 19th century, due in part to the increased prevalence of on-the-job accidents in newly mechanized industrial workplaces, as well as to the horrific increase in battlefield maiming during the first modern industrialized wars. Disability and transness have much in common in that they are both statuses are acquirable, move bodies down the hierarchies of life, and stage social anxieties about bodily transformation that compel a person previously considered normal to become socially abject. They offer evidence that bodies are alterable in ways that belie that fantasy, manifested in racial beliefs that express the unconscious desire for embodiment to remain unchangeable, and therefore a suitable means for permanently fixing people into ranked social categories. Frances Thompson's precarious life offered an easy target for taking aim at all such fears. It's no longer possible to determine whether Thompson was disabled or not, or which reporter was lying. The one who said her legs were as curved as the horns of a ram, or the one who said that her impairment was a pretense. Like asserting a trans identity or making a claim of rape, the reality of being disabled is routinely challenged. Like disabled people, transgender people are often suspected of being fakes, malingerers, con artists, and criminals who are simply trying to perpetrate a fraud. What matters more than the impossible task of adjudicating the truth of Thompson's claim is acknowledging how often she had to assert herself against multiple accusations of self-misrepresentation, how frequently she was forced to sustain herself in the face of persistent acts of erasure, how vulnerable she was to the undermining of her own sense of reality. When the existence of one transgender person is turned into a public spectacle, it rarely fails to draw attention to others. This was certainly the case in the Frances Thompson affair. The Daily Appeal reported in August on what it called a Frances Thompson epidemic among the Negroes, and described 2 additional cases that had been reported to the press. One involved Ann Casey, who'd been arrested for vagrancy and while incarcerated was discovered to have male anatomy. Casey told reporters that because of her delicate build, the other slaves in the household in which she had been raised had dressed her in feminine attire since early childhood, and she had simply grown accustomed to presenting herself as a woman. She had taken to wandering since her emancipation and would flee to a new town whenever she was suspected of being male. The other, far more extensive case of what was called Crutchy Ism came to light in New Orleans, where it was reported that, quote, a gang of men in feminine appearance who in long clothes impersonate women and as such secure employment as domestics, preferring to be thus rather than as nature destined them. Being at the eye of a national storm in a contentious political climate had devastating consequences for what little was left of Frances Thompson's life. The crowd that came to taunt her while working on the chain gang was so large that it blocked the sidewalks. And after picking up a paving stone to hurl at the head of one of her tormentors, Thompson was confined to the jailhouse, where she was put in charge of the laundry. In a jailhouse interview with the Daily Appeal, she railed, in that newspaper's words, against the white persons who had brought him to this country, and said that it was they who had knowingly allowed her to dress as she did her entire life, who, quote, should be punished if anyone is to suffer for his wearing of women's attire. She described her confinement as persecution and complained that the police treated her, quote, very grossly whenever an opportunity presented itself, exhibiting her with evident delight to the curious eye of the public. When she announced that she planned to leave the region as soon as she was released, the police responded by photographing Thompson in both men's and women's attire so that the image, quote, could be sent to other cities and prevent this hideous criminal from playing the same role again. The images, a collision and collusion of the forensic with the spectacular, circulated in Memphis like souvenirs from a lynching. They were reproduced as woodcut illustrations and circulated nationally in the day's doings. What we might call one's social appearance is the effect of a coordinated assemblage of looks, styles, acts, movements, locations, and relations with others that the technologies of image capture disarticulate, select from, stage, and recontextualize in the act of producing something that passes for verisimilitude. The images published in the day's doings did not document Thompson's social appearance. They demolished it. Represented in menswear, Thompson is made to appear in a manner that successfully cites the visual codes that reproduce cultural beliefs about what constitutes the reality of gender. She looks like a man. For the photo of her in feminine attire, her usual clothing having been confiscated, Thompson's, quote, female rigging had to be improvised, as the day's doing phrased it, and was not put on so daintily by Mr. Thompson as Mrs. Thompson would have done it in her day. Rather than showing how Thompson appeared in daily life, the image functioned primarily to humiliate her by staging her incompetence at looking like a woman. She looks like a man in a dress. She looks broken. Karl Marx famously wrote that, quote, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The same could be said of how trans people are able to appear at any given historical moment. Thompson certainly did not appear as she pleased, and the circumstances under which she was compelled to appear link these only known images of her to legacies of objectification that stretch back to the earliest histories of the photographic medium. There is nothing new in pointing out that the camera has been a tool for domination, a machine for mechanically manifesting a gaze that subjugates and represents what it frames, thereby rendering the objectified body into a visual resource for the reproduction of dominant relations of power. The camera records what the abstract machine of the social surveillance apparatus seeks to see, as the individual bodies that compose the collective body politic are perpetually observed, their particularities measured against a grid of norms and ideals, their differences targeted for correction or cultivation. The ethnographic illustration, the medical case study, the criminal mugshot, are kin who haunt the background of even the most self-actualizing of photographic portraits. They provide the context, transmitted from the past yet still operating in the present, within which the non-normatively sexed and gendered are compelled to appear, and within which we struggle to appear as we desire to be seen. After serving her sentence, Frances Thompson left police custody, destitute and in dire health. She took shelter in a ramshackle shack on the edge of the bayou, where she was discovered days later suffering from severe dysentery, which she had acquired in jail. Members of the Black community took her to the city hospital, where she died the following day, Friday, November 3rd, just in time to make headlines once again before the presidential election was held the following Tuesday. Of the dead say nothing but what is good is an old Latin proverb, the Public Ledger editorialized after printing Thompson's death notice. But truth compels us to state, but few more notorious villains ever cursed the earth than was Frances Thompson in life. After a long and infamous lewdness and wickedness, he sleeps well. The election of 1876 turned out to be the most closely contested in U.S. history. It still holds the record for the highest turnout of eligible voters at nearly 82%, a testament to how momentous the outcome seemed for the future direction of the country. Tilden, the Democrat, handily won the popular vote and captured 184 electoral college votes to Hayes's 165. But 20 electoral votes, all from the Deep South except one from Oregon, were disputed by Republicans who charged the Democrats with suppressing the black vote through outright terror and intimidation. After months of political gridlock, the national political leaders struck a dubious deal. The so-called Compromise of 1877 awarded all of the contested electoral votes to Hayes, thereby giving him a one-vote margin of victory over Tilden, 185 to 184, and allowing the Republicans to retain the White House. In exchange, the Republicans agreed to abandon Reconstruction. This in turn allowed the Democrats to gain control of all the southern state houses, dismantle the political gains blacks had made over the previous decade, and institute the apartheid regime known as Jim Crow. Although Frances Thompson's sad story played only a small role in that momentous struggle, her death and difficult life offer an eerie premonition of racial and transgender issues that continue to haunt the political imagination of the U.S. polity a century and a half later. At another historic moment in which minority rights are being rolled back in the aftermath of another contentious and contested election. Transgender issues played an outsized rhetorical role in the 2016 Republican presidential primaries in ways that suggest a persistence to the problematics of governance that Thompson was burdened with exemplifying. Campaigning that summer in Indiana alongside Indiana Governor and future Vice President Mike Pence, Ted Cruz pinned his last hope for halting Trump's momentum on waving the bloody shirt of transgender rights in town after town to rile up his supporters. Appearing before a large crowd in Knightstown, Indiana, with his two daughters, aged 7 and 5, standing by his side in matching pink dresses, Cruz drew supportive boos and hisses when he told the crowd that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton both agree that grown men should be allowed to use the little girls' restrooms. Failed candidate Mike Huckabee had gotten the ball rolling more than a year earlier, when he shared a prurient fantasy with attendees of the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in Nashville, Tennessee in February 2015. Huckabee imagined what could happen if transgender people were allowed to share space with non-transgender people in toilets and locker rooms, based on how he imagined he himself would act. Quote, "Now I wish that someone had told me when I was in high school that I could have felt like a woman when it came time to take showers in PE," Huckabee said to much laughter. "I'm pretty sure that I would have found my feminine side and said, 'Coach, I think I'd rather shower with the girls today.'" In November of that same year, in a foreshadowing of North Carolina's notorious bathroom bill, HB 2, the following February, transgender issues would be used to overturn HERO, the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, a sweeping piece of anti-discrimination legislation, by reductively characterizing it as a bathroom bill. Its opponents focused with laser-like precision on the supposed danger of transgender women using the ladies' room. Houston's airwaves were inundated with television ads that showed a predatory white man entering a women's public toilet, hiding in a stall and emerging to corner an unsuspecting little white girl, with a somber voiceover narration that warned if hero was not repealed, quote, any man at any time could enter a women's restroom simply by claiming to be a woman that day, even registered sex offenders. While Frances Thompson's tragically foreshortened life staged the intersectionality of transness, blackness, disability, and sex work, the campaign to overturn Hero imagined their interchangeability. The campaign's television ad literally substituted the figure of a white trans woman represented as a deranged male sex predator in girl drag for the more familiar fantasy threat of the black male rapist as the most salient danger for white womanhood and the birth of the white nation. On display here is the fear that bodies can slip their chains and lose their imagined ability to anchor persons in a social hierarchy. The fear of a supposedly normal body transformed by disabling trauma, the fear of the transgender body that appearances can be deceiving, the fear that grows from the long history of racism rooted in the desire for social hierarchy to be grounded in differences of the flesh. The political stakes over contemporary controversies about transgender toilets are thus not dissimilar to those that animated post-Civil War Reconstruction. As preposterous as the hullabaloo over where transgender people should be allowed to relieve themselves seems at a certain level, at another, it touches questions of governance and public policy that are perhaps rationally irresolvable. Whose body is recognized as legitimately belonging to the collective body politic, rather than being a resource to be exploited for the benefit of others or to be eliminated as waste? Which bodies shall be fully accommodated in public space? How does the public sphere afford or deny access to various classes of people, and who gets to decide? Within a federation that divides governmental powers between local, state, and national levels, how are disputes over who counts as a citizen entitled to equal protection under the law to be resolved between culturally different geographical regions of a sprawling nation, other than by brute force? The answer to these very questions are precisely what was at stake in Reconstruction, and they raise the unsettling question of whether our current difficulties are just another battle in an ongoing and unresolved civil war. I would say yes. This is what transpires now. When we trans people manifest the realness of our identities, when the light of a current calamity illuminates stories of the oppressed that have kinship with the present, and we weave them into the reality-conferring narrative that we call history, we can bring worlds along with us. We have learned for the sake of our own survival that deep transformation is actually possible, both individually and collectively. It is our gift to others to bear witness to the fact that this is a capacity harbored within us all. Thank you.